Excellent. So we'll get going here, guys. Happy Monday. Very happy to see all of you here or see you join our webinar today. I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Cheryl McLeod. Cheryl brings more than 35 years in global supply chain management across virtually every industry. She's a global transportation business owner, a federal contractor, and a licensed U.S. customs broker who's handled trade compliance for some of the world's top shippers. She's also holds a doctorate in global supply chain management and teaches logistics and project management at the university level. Her specialty is where global supply chain regulations meet the bottom line, how important and how import and export rules really impact the company's profitability. So you're in expert hands today. So join me in welcoming Dr. Cheryl McLeod.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I appreciate that introduction, and I look forward to sharing more with this class and the purpose of this webinar today to help everybody. I want to let everybody know as I move along through the discussion here today, if you do have any questions, or if I maybe am touching on a particular topic that actually hits home to you, because no one else is going to see all this stuff in the chat. Please feel free to ask questions or put in comments so that we can work to make sure we address any of those particular needs as we work through the discussion points today. As we know, AI is on the rise. The need for modernization to take place within the government and the changes in order for there to be more accountability and controls. I've been teaching asset management for about 4 years now with the government, and I am very familiar with a lot of the problems that happen across agencies and find more and more that really, if you feel like you're out there working and you're all alone with what you're doing, you're not. The problems and the challenges that you're facing every day, you can be assured that the person with the same position and title across the board is also facing those same challenges and problems. So there's more and more pressure with the government to be in line with budgets. There's less money within the budgets. There's also less labor a lot of times. And more importantly, you're finding that there's a lot of overlapping responsibilities. In the asset management side, I find that they're usually doing 2 or 3 different jobs. And that definitely makes a huge difference with their ability to stay on top. And sometimes inventory management becomes the area that's least addressed along the way each day then becomes a bigger and bigger challenge for him. Aging infrastructure, I'm sure most of you are working with a system called Sunflower. 75 agencies are using that system, and it's becoming more difficult for people to be able to keep up with controlling where their assets are and where they're located, and the aging infrastructure of a lot of the equipment that's out there. So there's a huge need for modernization across the board and the control of the budgets and the use of the budgets in a different way that we're going to kind of talk about here today. You know, what's really required, and forecasting. How many of you are involved in the actual forecasting plans, right? So to be able to actually see who is actually in control of that and how that impacts the way that contracts are created. And in this day, looking at AI for government technology, there's also a huge shift in the way that contracts should actually be created. Doesn't that make sense? So the other big problem is the lack of collaboration. How many of you send out communications and it takes a long time for you to get a response, right? So, and also interconnectivity between the various agencies. That is also another area where there's complete blindness that is taking place. So collaboration is probably one of the biggest keys that is going to be important for change and moving into the modernization age with AI. Where's something at, why it's there, how long should it be there, the failure to locate the assets that for accountability to the public because of the taxes that are paid. um, the loss that happens in the taxpayers' funding, and the slow and disconnect areas that come between finance, procurement, and oversight. So we're obviously moving into an age in technology where information flow is critical in order to be able to track and look and see what's actually happening in the future, right? So we want to make sure that we're kind of really looking at what is happening, where you're at, what your total budget is. Okay. Who is involved in that? Who actually creates that? Who is collaborating in your agency or across your agency? How much infrastructure, equipment? Of course, when we start looking at assets, there's the range of assets for the government is huge, right? And also, each asset may require a different level of oversight. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we kind of move into here and looking at assets. And most people are still using Excel reports, right? So if you're using Excel, then you know that a lot of times, if that's a working document, there can be problems with um, what was put into the Excel, who put it in, how old it is, and whether or not it's even accurate, right? So let's move on and talk a little bit more about the current challenges in government asset management. And as I said earlier on, these are very common. So please don't feel alone out there when you're working with some of the day-to-day issues that you're dealing with that sometimes can lead to emergency cost, right? Which is what you're trying to avoid, because we know if you have equipment and it has not been properly maintained, and then all of a sudden an emergency arises and you need it, you're going to have to pay a lot more to get that taken care of than you normally would if you had the right insight into what was happening with your fleet and the particular needs. So, who sometimes feels like they're dealing with the most inaccurate inventories? A lot of you. Maybe, yeah, there you go. Give me a thumbs up. Maybe you were given the responsibility to take on a particular job and oversee the asset management within an agency, and you find that there's no records. So there might have been changes within the Excel report, but there's no records to back it up. So record keeping is critical, right? Along the way, and learning how to make sure that you have those proper records to back up every single change that takes place. Finding the records, making sure the people who are supposed to give you the records are accountable. Probably have that problem too, right? Chasing down people looking for the information that you need, and working with, as I said, these outdated systems. So because of where we're at in the world and we know what's happening, it also creates new challenges for everybody out there, because the world as was is no longer the same, right? So we have duplicate assets out there a lot of times because of lack of controls over ordering. Our orders were made and contracts are set into place. The assets were delivered, but nobody knows where they are or where they ended up, right? So what happens? They send the order again. Do you have backlogs on your maintenance, your oversight, and that might not even be under your control. So you're having multiple divisions and individuals, again, with multiple responsibilities, maybe overseeing asset controls and the different divisions. And you're just supposed to be keeping the records. How about lack of visibility? I bet you I can get a lot of thumbs up on that one. How many of you are working and overseeing the record keeping and the logs, but you've never even seen the merchandise, right? That's a big problem too across asset management with the government, is that lack of visibility. So, and how the operation might be taking place in the warehouse, right? Receiving is so important, because if you don't have the right organization supporting you in the receiving side, then the paperwork from that very moment could be wrong or incorrect based on the data that's being input. And that's another reason why having the records to compare is so critical. Audits. How many of you audit on a regular basis? Have yearly, quarterly, regular audits that are being set up that you know that you need to be looking at and controlling. So that's another really important part of everything that is actually happening and taking place too, is have you set those audits forth and how many locations? Now we know that some warehouses for the government may be million square foot facilities. So in those cases, it may take you up to a week, a year to plan it because maybe 1 week out of the year, you're actually going to go in and actually have a full audit. And it may be 24/7 and the labor that's required, the training that's required, the setup, the equipment. There may be warehouses that are out in the middle of nowhere that you need to audit that there's no equipment on site, not even a pallet jack to move anything around. So there's huge accountability and responsibility just in setting up the audit procedures alone across an agency, depending on the number of locations and or the size of those locations that might be involved. So what is your biggest challenge today? Some people let me know what your biggest challenge is today. Does anybody have any challenges today that they want to share with someone? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Okay, so we'll just move on from here if there's nobody reporting any particular challenges today. Okay, so but as we move through this, let's think about it. I know across the organization, again, we need to look at leadership. And why is leadership so important? Well, leadership is critical in everything that you do. And one of the biggest processes that will have to take place across the board with setting up of new technology within an organization is going to be project management. And within project management, following the key points within project process and development and the laying the right foundation is always critical and being able to be successful. I have worked with large companies that have literally found after spending $100 million and setting up technology that there was complete failures across the organization and no ability whatsoever to even pull reports from the system, which is unbelievable to think about. So when you think about looking at being successful and overcoming your challenges, you need to make sure that you have proper leadership. And that's the person who sponsors that project and has the ability and the power to ensure that you get what you need to see the project through. So even if they're not involved in the day-to-day work, they need to actually be the one who heads it up. So in that, you're going to need to be defining roles. You're going to need to be looking at who's responsible for what, because that gets into your work breakdown sheets and who's accountable for each area, how much time was allotted to that, and training. Training is critical, and controlling and making sure that you know who was trained and when they were trained and what they were trained on is also very important. There are many projects that involve, billions of dollars and returned revenues. And so without understanding the training process, you surely cannot ensure that an organization understands what is at risk when there's failures throughout the organization that needs to be done. And also sometimes this also involves new operational structures for ensuring that there's effectiveness and the changes that are going to take place. So I cannot stress enough. Also, even having standard operating procedures in place and the development of standard operating. So everybody knows what their job is, what their responsibilities are, who they report to, and how often things need to actually change. So making sure that these records are in place and the systems and the flow and moving forward, because what we're going to talk about next is also looking at understanding that without having without having the proper oversight and the right data in place to start with, you're never going to be able to be successful anyway. And that's where a lot of the biggest problems and challenges come in today, is that nobody's really for sure. I mean, we know there are some government agencies out there that have been working on using technology. We'll talk a little bit more about that, where they've been successful, maybe where some of the challenges have come. But also, those agencies too have literally been reporting a loss of billions of dollars in assets over the last 20 some years. So they recognize the importance of them being able to find a better way and a better system, and being smart with visibility. So visibility comes in many different forms. And of course, data in, as we all know, bad data in produces bad data out, and that's the foundation. So those of you who are overseeing asset management and involved in making sure that the records are right, in order to move forward with any of these new technologies, you have to make sure that you know, which will start with going back to that audit, making sure that whatever those records show is in fact what is and where it is and how much of it and everything matches up, and how to actually oversee and control an audit too is very important, in order to be able to do that. Working with reconciliations. If there is a problem, how do you reconcile? Who approves those reconciliations? And how will that be recorded at a later date? RFID tagging. Equipment sometimes comes and it may be tagged completely different than an actual item or what's inside of a box. And so that controls a different way of looking at how you're controlling your records, and or the warehouse, the third party that you may be dealing with, versus some agencies who have their own warehouse operations and control their own audits and oversight. Okay. And of course, a lot of that impacts how well you can also do your job. But it also creates an opportunity, right? Because as we look at all of this and the changes, we not just want to look at where you're at, we want to think about where you want to be. Okay. And how you're actually going to get there. So preventative maintenance is obviously a great way, when you start looking at the life cycle of equipment, breakdown, emergency repairs, facilities, vehicles, buildings, and even with technology and how it can be used to control costs within a building structure. Because you can use it to turn the AC up, turn the AC down, the heat, the lights, and the controls within that area. And that also offers huge savings, and not only in cost, but also even in carbon emissions when we look at sustainability, when we're looking at supply chain management as another unique area of opportunity. Also, the use of some of the newest technology that's right at your fingertips on your keyboards every day, with using Chat GTP as an opportunity to plug in a question and get back an immediate answer. So I don't know how many of you may or may not be using Chat GTP. Maybe some thumbs up with some of you that might be aware, there you go, of how you can use this day to day. Great benefits right there to be able to ask a question, get results, and better perform at your job every day with the application of that. Because at the end of the day, what are we really working towards? Avoiding waste. Okay, avoiding fraud, avoiding duplicate purchases, understanding what the result of that is in waste and cost against the budget, and then actually working and planning. And so you've got to be able to basically be using proactive ways, okay, of working towards the future with what you do. So AI basically supports and controls procurement, contracts, even going back and reviewing how's that contract set up, what was originally, and what should, or could be a part of what you're doing for the future based on the types of items that you're working with and the particular needs. Because we're living in a very disruptive world where constantly channels are changing, raw material access is changing, and how all of that actually impacts the acquiring of the asset itself. Okay, so it's not just placing that order, it's looking at the big picture. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the very end of this review today. So, life cycle returns and disposal, the actual final disposal of the goods, and tracking and controlling those and understanding the needs through the entire process. And more importantly, creating operational efficiency. It's not just who you're working with. Do you understand inside of that operation and facility, even if it's just your computers that you're controlling and the return of those, making sure that there's operational efficiency that is taking place. So where it is, why it's there. I mean, not everything's inside of a warehouse, right? Sometimes things are stored outside of a building structure within themselves. So, but it still goes back to being smarter. And that goes back to understanding through visibility, through the strategic planning phase of any type of program or change and moving forward. A lot of times challenges, though, are obviously going to be a part of it, and they're part of your project management overall review. Inflation, we can't control the fuel costs. Fuel costs are usually built in to fluctuate within contracts for transportation and controls. And nowadays we see that more than we probably have in a while. We have labor shortages, whether it's domestic or international, that are a part of this. Whereas you look at manufacturing for the future, in asset management, you have to think about what was the old blue collar workers. They are now called white collar workers. Why? The skill set that is needed is completely different than the old skill set. Okay. And decision making, technology, and knowledge combined. And AI certainly does not remove the human aspect. Okay. So don't think, oh, because we do all this, we're not going to be needed. You're definitely needed because AI is not perfect. Okay. So we need to remember that because the human aspect of it is very, very important. So with these geopolitical disruptions that are taking place, resource shortages and controls to actually have access to the resources that are critical for the manufacturing also play a big role in what's going to be available. If you have a disruption, one simple good example would be a disruption in Taiwan, which would disrupt the chip industry, which directly impacts computers and autos. So we saw this in 2020 with COVID with the automobile industry. But if we see this because they produce 70% of all of our chips required, you can see the cost of computers go very high. And you would also see maybe taking months to actually get access to them. This goes back to your procurement, your forecasting, and what you have in the systems and availability. And that kind of goes back to the difference between a government agency working from a logistical standpoint versus looking at the whole supply chain and disruptions. But it also is critical when it comes to looking at tracking through your systems and availability and understanding the overall process that can happen because you want to move from a reactive state to being proactive. And that requires looking at what is happening from a global perspective for you to be able to understand how that's going to impact your direct needs. And while AI can certainly do this and help you work through all of this as you bring in the new technology, you need to make sure the right information is put in again, your audits are in place so that you can move forward with a firm, strong foundation to make sure, and also vendors. So we'll talk a little bit about that too, if we think about how vendors impact the process based on looking at cybersecurity, especially cybersecurity, because a lot of times with new technology that's built in, there becomes new connections between the various suppliers and organization that also can open a window for a breach in cybersecurity. And this is why collaboration across every point within the agency is critical in strategic planning risk analysis and mitigation of risks if they should happen when you're moving into using any type of technology. And it goes back to that foundation of that project management and controls. So we know if we have fleet optimization, that you're going to make sure that things are available, running in good order, and not going to fail, because that can go from defense to your basic agencies, to your automobiles, to your basic day-to-day uses within your operation. Also, it'll help you with potentially looking at lowering your fuel costs. A good example was how UPS changed from any turn within a routing to the left to right, which actually helped them optimize their services and lower their fuel costs and scheduling and controlling of routes, and also even in carbon emissions and how things were being done. It's amazing when you look at various examples of who's done what and how they've used various techniques in order to be able to set new controls. And IT, even asset lifecycle management within just computers, as I mentioned a while ago, which are critical for every agency and everybody working today, is to have good systems that are up to date and manageable. And when those need to be recycled out and returned, and also cleaned out before they're actually disposed of. Okay, the whole life cycle process of just a computer. Surplus property, a lot of times I've worked with agencies, and when they've looked at what they've really had, they found that maybe the whole back of their warehouse was still full of old furniture. And so they really needed to remove that off of their books. They needed to clean out their facilities. They needed to reevaluate their space utilization. Because that could make a huge difference, and maybe obviously the budget, because maybe what they were using their space for wasn't appropriate, or they needed to consider bundling their operations with another organization and another facility. And all of those small dimes and quarters add up to be quite a bit of money at the end of the day. Okay, so surplus and removing anything that you're not using or no longer need is also a critical part of your audit, your reconciliation. Energy efficiency of buildings. I talked about that a little bit, and thinking about, AI and the application of that to how energy is actually being used. So as we think about real government cases, we still have to look at your challenges, which are struggled limited budgets that you may be dealing with, your aging infrastructure, your staffing shortages, which many times this is the problem why people are having to do 2 or 3 different jobs. And maybe your boss is dictating what is a priority for you every day, as certain things might be falling behind. And as I said, sometimes asset management or oversight is one of those areas. And then the growing expectations of the public who are looking in at what is actually happening. What we're going to find more so in the future too is what is called the controls tower concept. Who's ever heard of that so far? The control tower concept within supply chain management. Anybody got a thumbs up out there on anything? Okay. Control power, we're going to see more and more of. And control towers, I think the best way to kind of imagine this is thinking about the space when we see Cape Canaveral, and we know that there's going to be a takeoff, that in the old days, even in the movies, you see a whole bunch of people sitting in a room and they're looking at the missile controls and watching what is actually happening in real time and visually seeing where things are moving. Well, this is what we're moving into with supply chain. It's a very interesting time and age. As you think about, you have maybe a large global company who's got what's called a control tower in one country that is working 24/7 and overseeing the entire world, so that they can understand what they have, where it was routed, how it was routed, and at any particular time, if there's a global disruption, how it would be rerouted for instant decision making. And this is part of the great use that's coming along with the Internet of Things, and also the use of the connection of the Internet of Things and AI and how they work together. The Internet of Things is the devices, correct? And then AI is the data itself. But the two of them need to work together in order to be able to deliver the right information. So these new visual concepts is going to create a whole different way of visually seeing how something is moving, unlike anything that's ever been presented before. So we want to make sure that we move and think about AI as it categorizes, okay, your items for you and helps you better control what you have. It also helps to in demand or matching if there's been more of something purchased than should have been purchased and the impact that had on the budget, or what happened to the excess that was delivered and then maybe never used, especially when you look at the Department of Defense areas. It also assists in looking at in the disposal of goods, what the actual market value should be, which is a great way to look at if you're going to have to eventually put it up for public sale. If no one within the other government agencies need it, then what that should be sold for or auctioned off for. And also reducing storage time within what you are purchasing based on turnaround. And thinking about that, one of the things that has changed, I'm sure you've all heard JIT, just in time. Let me look at getting it just when I need it. Well, we know at 9/11 that changed because many companies, their manufacturing facilities went down because they didn't have one part. Because the one week down in airspace was 3 months of backlog. Okay, so as we move into this volatile world that we're definitely continuing to live in, we have to constantly be thinking about this and forecasting and looking at what we have and what we don't have. But more importantly, now just in time has been moved to what they call just in case, JIC, because now it might be more of we need to make sure we have these backups. Well, that goes back to the prior way things were handled before JIT, which was where there was more inventory, which did impact budget and cost. But if you have to think about that versus being completely down, you have to look at that as a risk mitigation, as a cost within your budget structure and analysis. Um, Energy. So let's think about if we have if we look at AI and we look at overall controls, what we want to do is think about going back to this reactive versus being, proactive. We need to be able to predict more. You need to move from the manual processes to a more automated process, but you need to make sure that the right data goes in, or you're going to end up with a problem on the other side. You also want to move from siloed work positions, okay, where you're just kind of being fed information and plugging something in without understanding the big picture, to more cross-agency collaboration, which will be absolutely critical for success, okay? You want to also look at moving from a wasteful situation to optimization of whatever it is that you have for the good of all in a different kind of way of looking at it. And you can do that when you actually have everything in your system properly and there's no more guesswork, okay, at what you're looking at. So clean data. Okay, strong governance and oversights. And usually that's development of procedures. How is this going to be done and who's going to do it and why and when? Staff training, which is absolutely critical. Cybersecurity controls within all of this is an absolute, okay, that must be considered. And the connections between any parties that take place, because that's a lot of times where your biggest breaches can come into a large organization is through a smaller organization that's a part of that overall connection. human oversight, which is still absolutely critical as a part of the process, and setting clear performance goals. And that goes back to that overall project. What are we doing? How long do we think it's going to take? How much is it going to cost? And who needs to be involved in this? Okay. And how often are we going to meet? When are we going to communicate? How are we going to communicate? It all goes back to that overall insight of how are we going to move into this new modernization stage that the world has with this new technology that is critical. So in the end, though, what you're going to end up with is smarter fleet operations. You're going to have a predictive maintenance process that's set into place. You're going to have your asset, whether it's IT systems or anything, better planning for use. How is it going to be used? When is it going to be used? Or do we not need this, and why? Did we not forecast properly? Because one of the biggest mistakes, and believe it or not, 70% of most companies involved in global trade are not automated. They do not have the technology in place. And so sometimes the forecasting part of it is still a guessing game. Okay. But with the disruptions that are taking place and the potential for critical parts of an item not to be available, the risk is too high anymore for the offset. So you've got to be able to strategically start putting the right pieces in place. So you want to make sure that surplus at the end of it, the surplus has been properly used, and also that if there are any costs that could have been lowered, that they've actually been lowered. This is part of really kind of getting ready. As I said, AI is not, it's not the magic trick. Okay. It's not magic. It's just another way of controlling and fixing and inputting and receiving data that gives you a better visibility for improvement on your outputs. And that's what you're really looking to achieve through this. Okay. If you think about it, even with the cybersecurity risks, if you think about the Department of Social Security and all the information that someone could extract from that, and being able to ensure that you have the right problems and solutions that are set up in advance to do it for your risks. Also, a must in the process is the change in the systems to avoid any creation of vulnerabilities and continuous monitoring that must be done and input that. So one of the problems that a lot of times people face is they'll put a system in place and they'll think, okay, the system is here. But they haven't put in place is the continuous oversight that needs to be done behind the scenes once all of that has actually been put in place. Because then if there are challenges and problems, they can see them arising and correct the problems as they move through it. So another part of a plan that actually helps in doing this is to start small. Sometimes taking on the full agency. And as we know, within agencies, there could be multiple parties overseeing assets. It's not just maybe one particular individual who has the information to all the various assets that are across the organization. So you might want to select one particular division that's controlling particular assets that you find to be the highest risk assets, and determine that you're going to start a small pilot program with measurable goals. And the reason why you do that is because you want to make sure that if there are any problems or challenges along the way, that you can work to overcome those. If not, it allows you to be more successful at the end of the day. It most certainly will. And working, but again, going back to the team, to having the right team in place so that you can, at the end of the day, promote trust, which is important with the agency and what you're working on doing, and avoid costly setbacks. As I said, I've seen companies work for years on particular programs and end up with really horrendous cost and not have at all what was needed in place, okay, for them to be able to ensure the right outcomes. And finally, I just want to talk about a little bit about ethics within this too, because ethics are important part of the process and ensuring that people understand. And a lot of times what will happen is a company might have an ethics policy, but it's not necessarily being followed. And or when you're moving into new areas of technology that they haven't even been developed and they need to be developed. And so that everybody understands what they're accountable for and responsible for. And on asset management, it may be even going back to the warehouse again. If you're not controlling that facility to make sure that the company that you're working with even has the proper ethics standards in place to work with you, going back usually to that standard operating facility. Um, and human leadership. Leadership is so critical when it comes to ethics. If you're the leader, are you leading with the right ethics in order to bring about the right results? So, and what these programs are actually going to involve. But sometimes just starting small, finding that right program that's going to be able to help you to ensure that you feel as a team. And actually this would be a great brainstorming session with everybody to look at all the various areas within the organization to determine which one particular program might be the perfect pilot program, and let everybody be on the same team moving that forward to determine why that particular program is the most important. So let's do just a little closing cost today. I did want to, and then we can get some questions because I'm looking forward to hearing what it is that you want to know more about. Obviously, we've discussed how it improves visibility, efficiency, and accountability, and how important those are, going back to that clean data, and that the human aspect is not being removed. It's still a critical part of what you're doing, and small wins to build the momentum and build off of that for everything that's actually happening across the organization. So, but judgment and oversight is really a critical foundation within the ethical part of what you need to do. And if we look at some of the systems that are out there from a government perspective, we actually find it's kind of small. There's been various programs going back to 2014 where Singapore as a country was a leader, and then Estonia, and in the United States, the Maven Smart system became a very big part of the DoD area starting back in 2017 as a project. And basically they were just looking to reduce the workload and expand the defense agencies. But it was also a very, very important program because it also involved the computer vision and also machine learning. So we know all of that is a part of the AI application. And that did involve the Army and the Air Force and the Navy and the Marines, space and various commands. So it was a very big project that started. And of course, with all projects, they had their successes and they had their challenges. Part of their successes was the reduction of analysis for processing and the use of information flow. Challenges, ethical concerns because of targeting, cybersecurity, information, and also the dependence on the private sector and the contractors, again, going back to whether or not they were totally depending on them for reliability with input of data into the system for accessibility or visibility, or whether or not they were receiving that. And that's another important point when you think about if you're going to do this and you're going to have open access to your portals, who is going to be responsible for that information? And could that potentially create other additional challenges, or maybe or not, you want to keep those controls internal. So there is some systems out there. There are government entities that are actually inputting them. The U.S. has been working with this, but now let's talk about what's coming too. Who is out there offering these programs? IBM, SAP, Oracle, companies that have been around forever. Okay, IFS that are expanding their systems and their intelligence, intelligence that they're making available. These systems definitely function differently, I would say, from the sunflower system that you've been used to. Going back to the digital twins, which is the control tower concept that I mentioned earlier. And this particular capability is, I think, would be super if you looked across all agencies, and a combination of looking at all current information being gathered and controlled at a point for asset management. But most of the digital twin right now is being used in the area of facilities, shipyards, transportation networks, which makes a lot of sense, and aircraft fleets, and how that particular side of the business is being controlled. From a defense focused platform, you're looking at Palantir, which is a huge government contractor right now, who has the ability to supply chain visibility and maintenance forecasting also, along with mission planning, which, if we all look at an agency, what is the number one thing you should be doing? What is your mission? That's always the question of the day. What is your mission, and how should you be ensuring that your mission is being controlled and that everything's being supplied the proper way? The other thing is getting back to your day-to-day desk opportunities and using GTP, Claude, which is government side, Gemini. There's many different ways that you can use some of these new technologies to actually help you ensure some asset life cycle automation, and which is a very high area within AI right now. Government interest specifically are in digital twins, the application of the control tower, supply chain visibility, which is high for anybody in any organization today, fleet readiness, which goes back to your forecasting too, and recognizing that too, that without the proper forecasting, you're never going to be able to meet the demand. And the problem with the forecasting usually goes directly back to data. And working with companies who sometimes say, well, this is what we did last year, so we're going to, based on current market, we're going to say, well, it's up or down 10% or 5%. And you can be assured that if you're working from that sort of a mindset on what you're doing, that you will have failures, whether it's getting the promotional or the product to the market at the right time, or whether or not it's just understanding how to meet your customer needs, whether they're internal or external. You're not going to be successful by doing just random percentages off of something that was written on an Excel sheet and nobody even maybe knows if the data is correct or not. I hope this overview has been good for you and has given you some insight into maybe what you could do or what other government agencies have been doing, and the purpose of artificial intelligence, and you working alongside it in order for it to be successful. Thank you for the little thumbs up there. I hate doing all the talking. I like it way better when it's interactive. So GSUSA has actually created some great new courses. The first 4 courses on this slide are brand new, and they're all about helping you get a huge insight into global trade. How does it really happen? End to end. How does it get to you? How does it get to the store? What impact do we have now, or what are we looking for 2026 and beyond? How it's transforming supply chain, modernization, how the Internet of Things works. Great exercises too. Huge day-to-day reality exercises within this that you can take back and apply directly to your organizations, that will help them better understand what it is that they need to be doing. And looking at, from a government perspective, a lot of times it's about logistics. You call yourself logistics people, whereas the other world calls themselves supply chain and oversight management. But how all of this really comes together under that government logistics and supply chain and AI, and how all of these can actually impact what you do have. I mean, when you look at logistics, it's shipping, the warehousing, the receiving, that supply chain. They're having to source those raw materials and understand real world applications. But if you can't meet the two of these things, you cannot fully grasp what is happening now and what will be happening in the future, and the impact it will have on your agency and your ability to actually meet your budget, stay within your budgets, meet the demands and the needs in a timely fashion, and to be able to supply. So thank you so much for letting me share with you today. And I hope that this has been some great insight into what's going on in the world and your agency. Thank you.
You did have one question, Cheryl, that popped up. Just in case, where did it go? This was an individual asked, are there any property scripts that could help with different kinds of reporting data being pulled from AI?
Okay. Can they explain that a little bit more so that I better understand how to answer that?
Um,
Repeat that again for me. Can you do that for me, Amanda?
of course. Are there any
Thank you.
property scripts that could help with different kinds of reporting data being pulled from AI?
I'm not really for sure about the property scripts that might be in use. It would depend, because I said that's been very limited within the government and who's actually had access to facilitate the use of AI. So I would say that for right now, that's probably something that would need to be built within the organization based on the project and need.
Great, thanks, Cheryl.
You're welcome.
That was Barbie, and she said thank you.
Oh, welcome. Okay, super. Is there any other questions from anybody today, or thoughts? Or did you feel like at least I was speaking to you and you understood, yes, I'm out here and I feel like I'm the Lone Ranger working all alone and nobody understands what I need? Trust me, you're not the only one. It's across agencies, and the strive and the push to get leadership to communicate and collaborate across the divisions is going to be the key to success and change.
You have many thank yous in the chat here.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.